Are you able to name me at least one major city that is in this area right here? Well, obviously, if you yourself live here, it's a bit of cheating. So, for me, a city. Biarritz, it's that way. Yeah, right around there.
On the map, Clément? Tessie Clermont-Ferrand? Clermont-Ferrand?
Yeah, no? Oh, yes? No, it's not in there. Toulouse over there, no. Toulouse. More like that way, Montpellier. Nîmes. After. It's true that it's complicated indeed. Maybe Limoges.
Or is it? They stay alert?
Many people do not necessarily know what is in this area, and for good reason it is sometimes nicknamed the void diagonal. Well, it's not completely empty over there. In fact, the term is not really used much anymore. There is simply much fewer residents than elsewhere. It's simply called a low-density area. And it is considered to be the case when there are less than 30 inhabitants per square kilometer. To give you an idea, the average in France is 105 inhabitants per square kilometer, so here we are much less. And in fact, there are other areas in France that are very sparsely populated. They are displayed here, and just there. Yes, I do know indeed. I think I could try a career change and become a weather presenter. In the areas you see here, only 6.5% of the metropolitan French population is counted. However, well, these areas make up 42% of our nation's land. But then, why call it the diagonal of emptiness as it's known? Today, well, it's still a fascinating topic, and we're going to explore it together today. This diagonal, it began to take shape between 1850 and 1950. Back then, the people living in this diagonal mainly worked. In the fields, except from 1850, an object will appear and will disrupt. Their daily life revolves around the combine harvester. So back then, as you can imagine, a harvester looked more like this. But it was truly a revolution at the time.
A sign of the times is the disappearance in our countryside of the four-legged horse in favor of the horsepower. Agriculture is on the verge of being renamed as agricultural industry.
In fact, the harvester, like the reaper or the thresher at the time, will reduce the need for manual labor in the fields. So instead of having 100 people harvesting by hand, now only one person is needed to operate the machine. Consequently, at that time, there is less work on site and in the fields, whereas conversely in the cities, it's absolutely the opposite. In cities, so in the second half of the 19th century, companies start to produce massively. They become larger. It's therefore the period of industrialization. Thus, some very rural areas will see their population move directly to cities, often called rural exodus, yet industrialization doesn't impact all regions equally. Many agricultural areas have seen residents leave, yet regions like Hauts-de-France have seen the same. Sustained industrialization in rural area. Sustained industrialization, sustained industry in rural areas, and therefore retain their populations in place to therefore prevent them from leaving directly into the major cities in the rest of France. But the combine harvester will not be the only object that will shape the territories of this diagonal. There will be, now be careful, it might surprise you, the bike. You've already taken my shoes, now my bike. To understand, let's create a character. Let's call him John, for example. John, he lives in a small village in our famous empty diagonal in the early 20s, and in his village, every day, well, the merchants move around. So they come to sell him what he needs to live. But one day, John buys a bike, and all of this will transform his daily life. The bike is the first means of transportation he owns, and he will actually use it to make round trips to the nearby town, a town that is a little larger than his own. And so it will allow him to go and get his own products in this larger town. What John does in his small village, other people will also do in their villages around. And thus, instead of moving around, well, now the merchants will start to settle in this town. And this is what we call concentration. The merchants, rather than traveling from the small village, will stay in this town, and so it is the different inhabitants of the villages who will come. The new mode of transportation will actually change the way we move around. It will speed up travel, and moreover, it will often reduce the number of stops, and by reducing the number of stops, it will concentrate the population in certain points in certain cities. Later on, Jean's grandson or granddaughter will acquire a car. attention. He still lives in our diagonal, but this time, instead of going shopping in the city where people are, well, this grandson or granddaughter will be able to go to a city a little further away. This other city a little further away will therefore gain, thus operating at the other's expense. Well, now you begin to see one of the initial points. As we progress through history, transportation increases. Allow us to go even further, thus the further away we get. Small villages to go to big cities, and the TGV for that is a very good example. Here is the latest addition to the French railway industry. The TGV 001, the super turbo train, on a Paris-Lyon journey instead of stopping. 20 times as the train used to do, the TGV will not stop. Only once at its terminus, so directly to Lyon. Direct consequence, you will have understood. The cities between Lyon and Paris find themselves less served and will slowly lose in attractiveness, in activity, and therefore ultimately in population size. And besides, if we look at this map of the TGV stations,
we can clearly see that our empty diagonal is completely off the radar. The same goes when we look at the cities where the major airports are located in France. I'll let you
Public transport and related infrastructure develop in populated areas. We aim to serve the population, so naturally we prioritize areas with more people. Consequently, less populated areas have fewer transport options. Thus, cities that attract through these dynamics.
And cities and villages, on the contrary, tend to empty out. If you live in a village of 1,500 inhabitants, you are surely obliged to go to the nearby town, to see a doctor, go even further, to go to the hospital. And the best example for that is maternity wards. Maternity wards are emblematic from this point of view in rural areas. Basically, it is considered that to have a functioning maternity ward, one needs 1,000 births for safety reasons, staff training,
medical and health
facilities.
Services, and therefore in rural areas today. If we don't have those 1,000 births, we won't open a maternity ward, or worse, we might shut one down. The fewer there are, the fewer young couples that settle, the fewer young people we'll have, increasing the overall population.
The population will not grow. It's therefore a vicious circle. The more people leave, the fewer transportation stops there are, the fewer shops, doctors, hospitals, or even schools there are, the less people want to settle there, and therefore the fewer children are born. That's how the population decreases, but also with it the services. Publics in a population still remains on site. It is obviously an eminently
politics. We have already had the opportunity to discuss it many times in our daily news format, whether on YouTube or in podcasts. Looking at this map of population density between 1,876...
We can clearly see our famous diagonal emerging. Today, we focus on emptiness. But emptiness is also the presence of fullness elsewhere. And the contrasts are increasing in France today. So, the contrasts are increasing because a part of the least populated areas continue to depopulate. And especially the most populated areas continue to populate. More emptiness, more fullness, more contrasts. All right, if you're ready, let's continue.
Our dear diagonal, so we saw that it was drawn, especially because many of the population, she went to live in the city, but it must be known that
we're
some
very
territories...
sparsely populated to begin with, and one of the reasons is this, the forest. And yes, for example, the territory of the Landes has never been very densely populated. It has long been a wetland area, and then in the mid-19th century it was decided to plant forests, notably to try to settle a population. But when you plant forests, you also don't need many farmers to take care of them. So ultimately, it's a territory that has always been sparsely populated. And despite its transformation into a forest from 1857...
The sparsely populated. But it's not just about the forests. A large part of the empty diagonal falls. You may see it right in the middle of the Massif Central. It is the largest mountain range in France, representing about 15% of the metropolitan territory of France. So yes, I agree. There are not mountains as high as in the Pyrenees or the Alps, but still, they are mountain ranges, and that doesn't necessarily help this region to develop. It's true that the medium mountain areas in France are often less populated than the rest of the territory. Often these are areas with slopes, less practical for agriculture, sometimes with poorer soils, and also areas where transportation can be more complicated, where there are no alternative industrial resources, and so on. So medium mountains have been for a long time. Less dense and have not benefited from the developments of the 19th and 20th centuries. On average or in high mountains, transportation is also complicated. To build roads, tunnels, viaducts, winding paths, and all that, well, it can cost a lot. And as a sign that transportation is complicated and that there is this vicious circle that I mentioned earlier, Ardèche, for example, is the only department in metropolitan France. Without a public station, it only has freight trains. But it's impossible today to take a train directly to Ardèche from a station. In Cantal, for example, it's a quite similar issue. No traffic access. No road cuts the department in two. This is mainly due to the volcanoes in the middle of the department, so all the roads will therefore revolve around. And inevitably, all daily journeys will become quite long. And this ties in with what I was telling you about. These territories, for example, are used for breeding. For instance, in the Morvan forest area, one can find these magnificent Charolais cattle. By the way, for the anecdote, in some of these departments, there are literally more cows than inhabitants. And if you really don't believe me, here's the proof with this map created by the excellent mapper, Jules Grandin. Here we observe these diagonal territories. Either they were sparsely populated initially for geographical reasons, or they gradually emptied throughout history. So what's happening now? Are these territories being repopulated? Well, if we take a look in the media, here's a small compilation of everything that can be read. We hear more and more testimonies of people leaving the city for the countryside, and even more elsewhere. People leaving the city for the countryside, and even more elsewhere.
COVID or small remote work.
A striking example. Paris has lost more than 120,000 inhabitants in 10 years and now has fewer residents than in 2000. These people who are leaving, they have a name. They are called the neo-rurals, and ultimately it's a little bit the opposite of rural exodus. The neo-rurals, a term that appeared in the mid-70s.
Because yes, living in the countryside is a way of life that many urban dwellers
dream a little secretly. At least on paper. Well, there are many reasons to leave cities. Pollution, noise, overcrowding, high prices. Overpopulation, rising costs, and so forth. I believe many of you are aware.
Cities
logically,
are emptying out, and supposedly people are moving to the countryside, so your diagonal flesh should in principle be repopulated. Except that's false, as you will have understood. It's not at all what we observe. The reality is quite different. Most people move from city to city. And why do we hear a lot about it? I think first of all, it's dreamy. And then, in the end, it's a somewhat exceptional phenomenon. When your friends move to the city, they move to the city, so they move. And when someone leaves the city to go to the countryside, it's an exceptional event, so we tend to focus on it. In fact, when we look a little closer, this diagonal, it doesn't gain in population. But then where do the people leaving the big cities go? Well, they eventually go
right next door. In general, what we call urban sprawl. It's the development. Settlement. So the settlement of population around cities. And so it's ultimately the extension of the city in space. According to the INSEE, sparsely populated municipalities located next to large cities are those experiencing the strongest population growth. For example, in Issy-les-Moulineaux, in Hauts-de-Seine, a city really close to Paris, to the point that some consider it as an extension of Paris, the number of inhabitants has increased by 31% between 1999 2015. And we observe the same thing in all the major cities of France. Let's think of Villeurbanne, located next to Lyon, with its 20% increase in population between 1999 and 2015, or in Martigues, next to Marseille, with a 13% increase involving both newcomers and city center residents moving to the suburbs for more space. Clearly, when referring to Martigues, here Les Moulineaux, or Villeurbanne, it wasn't low-density areas to begin with, and conversely, in Creuse, for example, we have fewer inhabitants today
French
than
people
a century
continue to
ago.
move, and there have been no major changes after COVID, and relocations are primarily from city to city, from metropolis to metropolis.
Potentially in the suburban areas around cities and coastal rural regions. However, it's complex. Indeed, some people do move to less populated countryside areas, but those people, them. And yes, retirees. So that's already quite good. It allows for new customers, for businesses, a new dynamic possibly in these villages or these small towns, but unless it's Robert De Niro or Al Pacino, well, these people won't have children anymore and therefore won't help repopulate this place. Furthermore, retirees are rather towards the end of their lives, so retirement facilities last 20, 30 years, and therefore it's not enough to revive demographic dynamics. So be careful. There are some territories that have indeed been repopulated, such as the countryside or small towns that may be near the coast. This is the case in Brittany, in Vendée, and also all around the Mediterranean. These have become very popular destinations, obviously very touristy, but again, it varies quite a bit depending on the regions. And actually a very good example to understand all of this is to take the Var as an example. On this map, we can see that the department is truly divided in two by the highway. Down below, the population is very dense, but up top, there are very, very few inhabitants who are present. In short, today we cannot speak of repopulation. Just look at this map from INSEE, dating back to 2019. That famous diagonal is visible. The diagonal is still here. So is this diagonal doomed to be so sparsely populated compared to the rest of France? Very hard to predict the future, but we can imagine some scenarios that could eventually encourage people to return to these isolated countryside areas within 20 to 30 years. The first thing that could help is related to innovation. Basically, we can imagine that if elements such as, for example, optical fiber are deployed everywhere, well, it could become a bit more attractive for people, for example, who work a lot from home. Well, as we just said, it remains to be nuanced. They may also decide to simply settle outside of large cities. The second scenario is that of climate change. You know, it's going to get hotter every year. In 2050, temperatures could sometimes reach 50 degrees in terms of heat in big cities. Here is the planned map with, as you can see, a population leak towards the countryside where the air is more breathable and less polluted. But again, it is most likely that it will be the wealthiest who leave, and it will only be during the summer in a second home, for example. So they may not necessarily live on the territory all year round, and this may not necessarily contribute to repopulation and to the revitalizing of these regions. The third most catastrophic scenario we could mention that could lead to repopulation of these regions is that of a collapse theory, theorized notably by researcher Jared Diamond. Now, it's the idea, therefore, that society could be hit by several crises to the point that banks, the supermarkets, major corporations, and power stations would all face bankruptcy, and a health crisis could emerge. The populace would have to manage on their own, alongside a notable series on Canal Plus titled The Collapse. On board this theme, we see the characters tempted to flee the cities to settle, especially in the countryside to feed themselves. It's the most pessimistic scenario. But it should still be noted, good. And the last scenario, which in this case is a question of will on the part of the authorities or the state, would simply be a matter of investment on the part of successive governments to ensure that already the populations present in these territories have adequate public services and thus go to have an investment policy, especially in terms of transportation and hospitals, to thus make these small towns or villages livable again. In short, a broad topic. I could have talked about it for hours. There is obviously much more to say about the daily lives of people, especially young people who may live in some of these regions. Many thanks to Benjamin, accompanied by Laurie, who are journalists within the team and who have worked on this topic. Take care of yourselves, take care of our loved ones, and we'll see you very soon.